On the 11th of November 2020, all 15 Democratic members of the Legislative Council in Hong Kong announced their intention to resign. They did so after China passed a law which allowed the LegCo to kick out members who they deemed a threat to national security. As soon as they did this, they kicked out 4 pro-democratic lawmakers, and the other 15 soon followed in solidarity. Now, the chief executive, Carrie Lam, was very happy with the change, saying that she welcomes a more efficient way in which laws can now be passed, but the pro-democratic opposition were a bit more cynical. The former lawmaker, Claudia Mo, said that with the pro-Beijing majority now being able to kick out anyone who disagrees with them, the Chinese government were essentially forcing them to quit. And the leader of the Democratic Party was even more cynical, saying that today spelt the end for one country, two systems. But why are Hong Kong and China different in the first place? And why are their freedoms finally being removed? The answer takes us back to a meeting in the 1980s between Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping. Hong Kong was a British colony between 1842 and 1997, which is when it was handed back to China. To soften the blow of the transition between governments, Hong Kong has a special arrangement in place called One Country, Two Systems, which guarantees Hong Kong is recognised as a separate entity from China while still giving China sovereignty over it. Among other things, One Country, Two Systems gives the Hong Kong people a right to final adjudication in their courts, the right to elect the LegCo, and some other fundamental freedoms such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly. Now, it's meant to last until 2047, and it seems like a pretty good deal until you look at the composition of the LegCo. The Legislative Council has 70 seats, but only half of these are directly elected by the people of Hong Kong. The geographical seats are directly elected, whereas the functional seats are elected by business interests in the city. In 2016, 19 pan-democratic candidates won a geographical seat. However, 24 pro-Beijing candidates won a functional seat, which gave them a majority in the LegCo. This isn't exactly democratic, but it's still different from what China has, so why is this? Well, as I said, Hong Kong was a British colony for over 150 years, being ceded bit by bit to the British until the final part was handed over in 1898 on a lease of 99 years. The Chinese government absolutely resented this. They saw it as a shameful, unequal treaty which was given to them in a time of weakness after the defeat in the Opium Wars. And when the communist government came to power, led by Mao Zedong and later by Deng Xiaoping, they were determined to get it back. And it came at a good time for Deng, because Hong Kong, having been a capitalist city, was extremely economically powerful, and Deng realised that China could benefit from Hong Kong's expertise in finance, technology and management. And ergo, when they had the handover in 1997, he wanted Hong Kong to maintain its prosperity. So they start to negotiate the handover in 1982, and Margaret Thatcher is hot off the Falklands War. And Deng Xiaoping is therefore worried about a few things. 1. Is Margaret Thatcher going to use force to secure Hong Kong like she did with the Falklands? 2. Are the British going to drain the resources of Hong Kong before the Chinese can use them? And 3. Are the British going to give the Hong Kong people so many human rights that they can't accept Chinese rule? Now, Mrs. Thatcher does indeed think they'll be able to retain control of Hong Kong. She argues that the British have learned how to administer Hong Kong and they're doing it well. And she also worries that Chinese rule in the area is going to make it unviable for investors. But Deng Xiaoping is having none of it. He argues that under the treaties signed by the British and the Chinese, Hong Kong is going to return to Chinese rule, whether Thatcher likes it or not. And therefore, their only sticking point in these negotiations are how to keep Hong Kong economically viable. Now, as well, Deng Xiaoping has this little spittoon that he uses to emphasise his points, and he spits into it several times throughout the meeting to show Mrs. Thatcher that he's really laying down the law. Now, Deng Xiaoping is worried about the Hong Kong economy, but he's far more concerned with undoing the national shame of Britain owning Hong Kong in the first place. Sovereignty is non-negotiable, so he points out to Thatcher that under the treaty, China is going to regain sovereignty of Hong Kong, and if she wants to start discussing the economic future of Hong Kong in earnest, she has to do so before 1984, because after 1984, China is going to unilaterally declare sovereignty over Hong Kong and put an end to the whole affair. Now this works, and Thatcher gets to the negotiating table and they agree on the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which creates One Country's Two Systems. Now this does guarantee a few things, but the main ones to remember are that Hong Kong keeps its capitalist system until 2047, and the human rights, final adjudication and elections, which we discussed earlier. they finally signed the agreement in 1989. One Country's Two Systems raises eyebrows from its inception, with a 1987 Asian Affairs article pointing out that any laws which violate the basic law or the state constitution will be considered counter-revolutionary or treasonous, e.g. anti-communist, and therefore they will not be allowed to be passed. This agreement essentially delays Chinese control over Hong Kong, but it does not give Hong Kongers the right to determine their own future, and this becomes a real problem just a few months after the declaration is signed, because on the 4th of June 1989, peaceful student protests break out in Beijing. These students are asking for democratic reform in China, but instead Deng Xiaoping sends in the army and massacres them. Tiananmen Square is so heavily censored in China that we don't even have official statistics for how many people died, but people in Hong Kong caught wind of it. They were terrified that this was going to be their future, so 1 million people took to the streets. That's 20% of the Hong Kong population at the time. Margaret Thatcher said this must have been a great lesson for the people of China, that Hong Kong people would not be so easily bullied, but I would argue that it wasn't really, and that China was actually more eager to suppress Hong Kong, just as the British were more eager to democratise them before the handover. Lord Patton, the last governor of Hong Kong, came to power in 1992, and he set about trying to democratise Hong Kong by increasing their fundamental freedoms and by increasing the amount of elected officials, but he was fighting a losing battle. On the 1st of July 1997 came the handover day. It was raining heavily, and the Chinese foreign minister said, "I'm sure that all of the Chinese in the world will see this heavy rain as washing away the shame of China's past." Chris Patton gave his final tearful goodbye to the colony, saying, "Hong Kong people are now to rule Hong Kong. That is the promise. That is the unshakable destiny." But the future of Hong Kong was not a democratic one. The chief executive was selected by China, and they immediately got to work repealing all of the reforms which Chris Patton had put in place. China finally had control over Hong Kong, and they were going to make damn sure that it was part of China. Now, the first 6 years of One Country, Two Systems are fairly peaceful. Yes, there are still protests and candlelight vigils for Tiananmen Square and human rights protests on handover days, but there's nothing quite on the scale of 1989. That is until the 1st of July 2003, when the LegCo attempts to introduce a national security bill. This bill would ban secession, sedition, treason, and all manner of things which the Chinese find to be anti-communist, and it lets them do that without any say-so from the Hong Kong courts. Now, Hong Kongers are having none of this. 500,000 people take to the streets, irate that One Country, Two Systems hasn't even been upheld by the Chinese government for a full decade, and the LegCo concedes and withdraws the bill. But this is far from the final time that China attempts to impose their will on Hong Kong. In 2012, the LegCo tries to introduce a compulsory national and patriotic education. Parents kick up a fuss, seeing this as an attempt to try and brainwash their children, and they take to the streets and force the LegCo to withdraw the bill. As it stands at the moment, China is getting nowhere implementing their ideology on Hong Kong, and in fact it seems that the absolute opposite is happening, with trends going in the other direction, because in 2009 they introduced a fourth core subject called liberal studies. The aim of liberal studies is to cultivate children's critical thinking skills and enhance their social awareness, and China absolutely hates this, and they blame it for encouraging students to take part in citywide demonstrations and unrest. And then in 2013 these conflicts come to a head when legal scholar Benny Tai, who was hereto trusted enough to advise the Chinese government, says that Hong Kong should have universal suffrage, and that they should have one person, one vote, and that they should be able to elect their chief executive rather than having it chosen by China. So he goes to China to negotiate this, and China does concede, well, a bit. They say that from 2017, Hong Kong can have an elected chief executive, but only if this candidate is chosen on a pre-selected list of candidates from a 1,200-person committee. And Carrie Lam, who would go on to become the first elected chief executive, says that the leader has to be someone who loves the country, loves Hong Kong, and isn't going to oppose the central government. Benny Tai is utterly unsatisfied, so he advocates for non-violent civil disobedience. He starts a movement called Occupy Central with peace and love, later to be known as the Umbrella Movement. He essentially asked protesters to block off main roads and business districts and to block off metro stations as well. Even though these protests are peaceful, the fact they're civilly disobedience draws the ire of Beijing. The protests start on the 26th of September 2014, with the police trying to disperse them using rubber bullets, tear gas and pepper spray. The protesters stood strong, using improvised protective equipment like cling film and goggles for their eyes, and the ultimate symbol of Hong Kong defiance, the yellow umbrella. This gained a lot of momentum with the youth, with one protester quoted in the BBC saying, "I was inspired by seeing all of these people standing up to the police using domestic props. On the one side you had police brutality, on the other side these poor umbrellas." The protests were not popular in Hong Kong, with 54% of people disagreeing with them. And while the protesters endeared themselves to foreign media outlets like the BBC with, amusing things such as apology signs outside of metro stations, they did not endear themselves to the police in the same way. The police were absolutely brutal, destroying their barricades with chainsaws and bolt cutters and securing victory without concession after 79 days. Now, Helia Chung's article in The Guardian argues that this is because the protesters had mismatched aims, such as disagreements on what universal suffrage would actually entail, and this made it hard for them to maintain the momentum of the protests past their end date. However, it did set the groundwork for civil disobedience which was to come in Hong Kong, as well as increasing the democratic engagement within the city. The 2015 local elections boasted a record high turnout of 57%, which, well, it's not great, but it does prove an increased democratic engagement within the city. And as well as that, 9 pro-democratic, pro-umbrella movement candidates defeated 9 pro-Beijing incumbents. And then come the 2016 LegCo elections, where democratic lawmakers go from having 27 seats to having 29. Now, this does undercut their achievements slightly, because it was squandered by a failed tactical voting system called Fund-A-Go. Fund-A-Go had intended to help the Democrats win an election by avoiding split votes, but instead it miscalculated it so terribly that, according to the Hong Kong Free Press, some pro-Beijing candidates who weren't meant to win did win because of this system, which is, yikes for Benny Tai, but you must feel a little bit bad for him because the demographics had shifted so significantly since the last election, and the protest movement had even given birth to a new form of Democrat called the localist. According to Ying Ho Kwon, localists are born out of an attempt to find a new way to fight against political intervention in Hong Kong. While a traditional Democrat is more likely to attempt to democratise and negotiate with China, a localist sees this as a pointless approach. They are more likely to argue for secessionism or even a return to British rule, although many of them do advocate for remaining part of China with Hong Kong freedoms. Ying Ho sees this as part of a demographic shift in Hong Kong, with older people likely to see themselves as Chinese even if they don't agree with communism, whereas younger Democrats are more likely to see themselves as Hong Kongers. And this has caused a great deal of tension within the pan-democratic community, but they would soon find themselves united against the Chinese response to the umbrella movement. Now, those of you paying attention will probably notice that I said there were 29 Democratic lawmakers after the election, but only 19 when they introduced a bill I talked about at the beginning of the video. And the reason for that is that LegCo began to try and kick people out as soon as the session started. By the 2nd of December 2016, the LegCo has already launched lawsuits to remove 6 pan-democratic lawmakers. 2 of them are from a localist party called Youthspiration. They aggravate the Chinese government by unfurling banners which say Hong Kong is not China to challenge Chinese sovereignty. Then one of them takes 10 minutes to do her oath, spending an inordinate amount of time on every single word to render the entire thing meaningless. Both of them refer to China as China, which they unconvincingly blame on their accents, and this is made even more unconvincing when one of them refers to the People's Republic of China as the People's Refucking of China, which is, well, we all make that mistake, don't we? They don't even last a month in the LegCo. Then, on the 2nd of December, the LegCo retroactively decides that 4 more lawmakers have made invalid oaths. An example of this is Nathan Law, who modified his oath to criticise the Chinese government, and he said that the oath was nothing more than a tool of the authorities trying to suppress public opinion. The LegCo wasn't happy about this, and they initially just made him redo the oath, and then they later on decided they had to expel him for it, based on the legal and enforcement concerns that Nathan Law hadn't taken his oath to the Chinese government seriously. In 2017, Carrie Lam becomes the first elected chief executive of Hong Kong, and she starts to crack down on the Pan-Democrats by jailing them. The Guardian said that the Pan-Democrats at the time worried that this meant that they were trying to stop them from running for office in the next 5 years. And then in 2018, Nathan Law, the leader of Demosisto, is jailed for a second time. By now it is utterly clear that Hong Kong is trying to get revenge on the Pan-Democrats for the Umbrella Movement, but they don't think that Hong Kong prisons with their human rights laws are exactly going to be punishment enough. On the 29th of March 2019, Hong Kong publishes a proposed amendment to the Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters Ordinance. This ordinance had essentially said that Hong Kongers who committed a crime abroad could be extradited to anywhere other than mainland China. The purpose of this was obvious. If a Hong Konger committed a crime in, say, America, then the Americans wouldn't feel bad about sending them back to Hong Kong, seeing as their human rights laws would be fairly similar. However, the proposed amendment would override this and change the wording so that Hong Kongers can be sent to any other place outside of Hong Kong, including any other part of mainland China, and this was a clear override of Hong Kong's courts. Before the bill was even published on the 15th of March, Demosisto hosted a sit-in protest, and then on the 31st, over 50 groups which were sympathetic to their cause did the exact same after the bill was published. But these protests would expand far beyond the scope of the Umbrella Movement and would show just how desperate things had become for Hong Kongers. At the beginning of the protest, the demands were simple. All that they wanted was for Carrie Lam to remove the extradition amendment. Of course, pro-democracy politicians and campaigners were key parts of the movement, so it is likely they wanted to push for universal suffrage, but this was not an express demand at the time. On the 17th of June 2019, the BBC wrote of the striking difference between these protests and the Umbrella Movement. They said that Hong Kongers were not protesting for more democracy like they were in 2014, but instead they were fighting to keep what they already had. Now, at first, it didn't look like Hong Kong was going to budge on these ones either. On the 4th of June, Carrie Lam said that she would not withdraw the bill because it was very beneficial to society, it would keep up Hong Kong's security, and it would fulfil their international duty. But on the 15th of June, she was singing from a different hymn sheet altogether, with the government having been forced to suspend the bill and to apologise. However, this didn't stop the protest like some hoped it would, because the protests had expanded beyond their scope, and now they were asking for 5 demands, not 1 less, and they weren't going to stop protesting until they achieved them. The 5 demands were the withdrawal of the extradition amendment, and the suspension of it just was not going to cut it. They wanted an independent inquiry into police brutality during the protests. They wanted universal suffrage for the people of Hong Kong. They wanted amnesty for all the protesters who were arrested, and they wanted the government to back down from classifying protesters as rioters, because under Hong Kong law, rioters get 10 years in prison. From the 17th of June, the police did slightly concede on classifying protesters as rioters, and they said that only 5 individuals were rioters. However, they said that everyone after this date would be considered a rioter, so it wasn't much of a concession. But the protesters had achieved a lot more than the 2014 movement had. So why is this? Well, the main thing, I think, would be the wider appeal, because even though the 2019 protests were still led by the youth, it had a bigger range of people from Hong Kong joining in, because they were worried not only about the extradition amendment itself, but they were also worried that their children were being subjected to heavy police brutality in response. As well as this, the tone of the protests were totally different. Protesters were joining in this time because they thought it was their last chance to do so. While in 2014, there was sort of the hippie-ish ideas of peace and love, in this one, a common motto was, if we burn, you burn with us. And people in Hong Kong really thought that this would be the end of one country, 2 systems. A CNN article points out that unlike 2014, these protests were largely leaderless and anonymous. The protesters wore face masks, they used umbrellas to cover up security cameras, and they also used single-use tickets on the metro instead of their transportation cards, worried they could be traced by police. Protesters use this Bruce Lee principle of being like water. Using encrypted social media, they'd plan pop-up protests and even report on police movements. This professionalism was extended even to their kit and outfits, with the Hong Kong Free Press describing them as having full gear, like gas masks and hard helmets. As well as this, they developed a simple uniform with black t-shirts, and they left changes of clothes for other protesters in the metro stations. They developed hand gestures to communicate with each other in the barricades, and they'd even come up with new, ingenious ways of extinguishing tear gas canisters before they caused too much damage. All of this made their confrontations with the police much more sustainable and made the movement much more long-lasting. There were some drawbacks to the leaderless model, however. Angry, unsupervised protesters could get increasingly violent as the protest went on. They threw anything they could get their hands on at police, be that water bottles or bricks. On Handover Day, there was a normal peaceful protest and peaceful march through the city, and then there was a storming of the LegCo, where Hong Kongers broke in and vandalised the building. They also doxed police officers after they started taking off their identity badges using an app called Telegram, which was simply meant to decrease police anonymity. The police did respond in kind by doxing the protesters themselves, releasing their names and addresses and mobile numbers, as well as trying to steal their mobile phones physically to get their hands on their personal data. The police definitely didn't use this data for good, as they were engaging in something known as a white terror, where they took hospital records of protesters who were being treated and used it to go in and arrest them, and occasionally even arrest their doctors who were treating them. To many, this proved that China was trying to put an end to one country, two systems, and they thought that if they didn't fight against it now, they might never get a chance again. Because of this worry, the 2019 local elections were a huge success for the Pan-Democrats. The turnout of local elections is usually a lot lower than that of the LegCo elections, but while in 2016 the LegCo elections had a 59% turnout, these local elections had one of 71%. This spelled absolute disaster for the China-backed communists. As well as this, the Pan-Democrats had a majority on all 18 of the local councils, even though they only actually controlled 17 because of Chinese government appointees. Local governments don't have an awful lot of power, but they plan to build on this momentum to win in the 2020 LegCo elections. They were going to use primaries to determine the most successful candidate so they didn't split the vote again, get a majority in the LegCo, vote down Carrie Lam's budget, and use it to hold her administration to ransom. This was incredibly embarrassing for the pro-Beijing camp. Carrie Lam had been saying the entire election cycle that they were going to win because they had a silent majority of people against the protests, and obviously this turned out not to be true. And the response from China was utter fury. The Chinese foreign minister says whatever happens, Hong Kong is part of China, and anyone who's trying to cause chaos in Hong Kong or jeopardise its stability and prosperity will not be tolerated. This was fighting talk, and China intended to see it through. Blocking the budget is a fairly common way to force compromise in democracies where the executive and legislative branches are separate. For example, in America, the Democrats used it to block Trump's border wall. But unfortunately, the Chinese don't want to compromise with the Pan-Democrats, and they wanted to find any opportunity they could to stop this from ever having to happen. Luckily for them, they were offered a golden opportunity by the pandemic. Miss Lam had initially had some problems dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. She told people not to wear masks in public unless they were visibly sick. She said this was because there was a shortage, but Vox points out it's more likely that she did this because masks have become such a prominent symbol in the protest movement. In response, hospital workers, thinking that they weren't getting adequate attention, went on strike for a week. Miss Lam also got some flack for refusing to completely seal off Hong Kong from the mainland. She did shut 11 of the 14 crossings into Hong Kong, but she didn't completely seal the island off, and this was blamed for a spike in coronavirus cases. From what I'm telling you now, it doesn't seem like Carrie Lam is exactly having as much fun as Jeff Bezos in the pandemic, but things would turn around in her favour very soon when the Chinese government reintroduced the National Security Bill. Now, the 2020 law is pretty much the same as the one which the LegCo tried to introduce in 2003, with the key difference being that this one is directly implemented by the Chinese government. The law sets out a series of vague guidelines by which someone can be considered a threat to national security, and it can punish them for this without any say-so from the Hong Kong courts. Now, this was not lost on most of the world. On the 27th of May, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that Hong Kong would no longer get special treatment from China because no one could say that they had any degree of autonomy over themselves anymore. And this effectively dragged Hong Kong into the US-China trade war. Now, the Trump administration probably thinks that this is a good economic deterrent to China to stop them from imposing their will on Hong Kong. But I don't think this is the case anymore, because in 1997, Hong Kong was 23% of the Chinese GDP, whereas today it is only 3%. And therefore, I just don't think that China has the economic motivation to maintain one country, two systems. As soon as the National Security Bill passes, Britain and Australia begin to act like the end of one country, two systems is absolutely inevitable. And despite the fact that both countries are tough on immigration, they begin to offer visas to Hong Kongers. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, Nathan Law and Joshua Wong resign from their party leadership, and the Demosisto party collapses as a result. The reason they give for this is that Nathan Law says that it basically violates every single right that they could have had, and it's so far-ranging that even foreigners can fall foul of it. Then the police carry out a series of arrests and raids, including arresting people who have leaflets in favour of Hong Kong independence, and they also raid the anti-communist popular newspaper Apple Daily and arrest their CEO. Then the government changes the laws about textbooks so it removes all motivations behind any form of civil disobedience so they can delegitimise these movements. But the LegCo can still vote on any laws they want as long as they're exactly what China wants, otherwise it's considered subversion. Then on the 30th of July, Hong Kong bans 12 pro-democratic lawmakers from running in the next election. Their reason for this is they say that those like Nathan Law have not been genuine in their intentions to uphold the basic law and to remain faithful to Hong Kong. And then the very next day, Carrie Lam delays the election for a year, citing, wait for it, coronavirus. But then, as a Democratic lawmaker points out, it's not very convincing that people are allowed to go to work, use public transport and wait in long queues if they then can't vote. So it's not very convincing. But the Chinese are absolutely adamant on putting an end to democracy, and they deliver the final nail in the coffin, the law which allows lawmakers to be kicked out if they're deemed to be national security threats. The LegCo immediately boot out 4 moderate members. These people were already banned from running in the next election, but they were meant to be allowed to finish their term. And then the rest of the 15 pan-democratic lawmakers resign in protest. The London Evening Standard did an interview with Nathan Law, who's now in self-exile in England. And they asked him essentially, why are you carrying a black umbrella now instead of the yellow ones, which was so synonymous in the 2014 umbrella movement? And Nathan Law gives a really, really heartbreaking reply where he says, well, yes, but a black umbrella symbolises another thing. Yellow speaks to optimism, black is despair, and that's how things are. In 2014, we were yellow umbrellas. Now we are black. Awesome. Thank you so much for watching. If you've made it this far, that's excellent. It took me absolutely hours to research and write this and film it and everything, so it really means a lot. And if you did like it, it'd be super helpful if you could just give me a thumbs up down below. Why Vote is just going to be a YouTube project where I talk about current affairs and history, maybe some other things as well, but mostly those two. If that sounds like your cup of tea, then stick around and see what I get up to. And just ring the bell as well, just because I know from subscribing to loads of YouTube channels that if I subscribe to one I don't hit the bell, chances are I'm not actually going to see anything that they post next. Yeah, and the Hong Kong situation as well is constantly evolving. If you want to find out more, I'm going to leave some links in the description about the sources I used, as well as an additional article that's just come out today on the day I'm filming about the fact that not a Lord Joshua Wong has pleaded guilty to his charges in Hong Kong. So yeah, so it is a developing situation. It's literally developing as we talk about it now, and it is as interesting as it is heartbreaking. I hope you agree with me there. But yeah, that'd be absolutely amazing. Thank you for watching. Bye bye. Turning out my light. Good night.